Today we'll be speaking about religiosity and well-being, and we'll begin by speaking a little bit about what we mean by religiosity, and then talking about the relationship between religiosity and our well-being, and we'll talk about how this applies to adults as well as how it applies to the youth, inshallah. And I'll try to give a lot more time for Q&A today, bi'idhnillah. I want to begin by showing this chart. This is a chart that is quite concerning for anyone who lives in this country. Every single year, there's a survey that is done, and this survey asks a number of Americans, how many of you, what do you identify with a religion? So if you look back in the 70s when this survey began, 95% of Americans, only 5 out of 100, said they don't identify with any particular religion. And if you looked at this number was pretty low for almost 20 years, from 72 all the way here, all the way to 1991, you see it's almost a flat line, right? 6%, right, in 1991. And then something happened starting at that time in the early 90s, where you can see that there's a linear rise where now, all the way into 2022 now, we're about 25% of the American public no longer claims to identify with any particular religion. Now, when people usually see graphs like this, they say, well, this is the non-Muslims. This is the Jews, this is the Christians, right? This does have to do with us. And I want to really begin my talk today by being very clear that the trends that we are seeing in America, collectively, on all the different social issues that Americans are facing, are the exact same issues that the Muslim community is facing, and the data is supporting this. So just to give this some context, where we see about 25% of Americans not identifying with a religion, about 1 in 5 children raised as Muslim do not identify with Islam in adulthood. Those are the statistics that we have now that have been collected through large polling agencies, even our own data, right, showing some of this. So the fact that people are losing their faith is a national phenomenon because of the rise in the liberal values and so on and so forth. There's a whole lot more to that. But I want to say this because this doesn't mean that everyone is atheist. This means that people are not identifying with a particular religion anymore. They might believe in God, they might have doubts about their faith, they no longer want to be a part of a church or a masjid or a community. So clearly there's a disenfranchisement with what it means to be religious or identify with a religion. Which leads to a question of what do we mean by even saying somebody is religious? We do it all the time kind of colloquially, right? We say, oh, you know, this person is religious, but that person is not religious. And when we use these terms, in our own mind, we have some definition. Someone might see somebody with a beard. I know this happens, right? Sheikh Muhammad and I spoke about this. They see the sheikh, and they say, don't know who he is, but they see a nice long beard, and they say, he must be highly religious, right? Alhamdulillah, he is. But there are many people who have long beards who are not religious. Many people who don't have beards who are religious. But again, what do you mean by religious? Or someone sees someone with short pants, then he must be religious perhaps to some people, right? Or they see a sister who's wearing an abaya or a hijab. Those are markers, right, of religiosity. But the challenge that we have as a community is not how other people define our religiosity, but how we define, as a Muslim, what does it mean for me to be a practicing, committed believer? And usually when people speak about religiosity, they talk about very superficial things. So our goal, this is coming out of our research at Yaqeen, is our goal is to understand the religious pulse of the ummah so we can understand our shortcomings and our weaknesses. Where are we lacking in our commitment to our faith, and how do we improve that? We also want to know what's working, and this requires us to have a much broader definition of religiosity than people often use. So how do people typically think about religiosity? The typical way of thinking about religiosity, even in like large surveys or in Western studies, is how often does somebody pray? And for non-Muslims, this is how often do you go to church? So if you go every single Sunday, you're very, very religious. You know, imagine in the Muslim community if we did this. He said, if you attend Jum'ah, then you're highly religious. He said, that's probably not a good measure of religiosity. There are people who don't pray outside of the Jum'ah, right? There's people who might. So it's just something you have to do, but by no means is it a complete measure of one's faith. Another way people use religiosity is simply to talk about how sure are you that God exists? And again, you can see this is a very poor measure. Someone can say, I'm sure God exists, and they don't even identify with a religion perhaps, right? So these are really, really poor measures to say how often do you pray, right? Or service attendance, right? Or even belief in God. Now these are all parts of religiosity without a doubt. And even worse is what you see in some of the modern surveys on Muslims, where they ask the person, how religious are you? Now most people, if you ask them, they'll say, you know, I'm pretty religious, right? Because in our mind, we all want to feel that we are committed, right, to this. So it's a self-report that has nothing to do with what you do or what you believe, just how religious do you think that you are. So our goal is really to sit and talk about, well, if you're saying these are not religiosity, and we want to have a better conception for ourselves and for our youth, then what do we have to, where do we start with? And there's a beautiful verse in Surah Al-Baqarah that I believe captures the breadth of what it means to be a practicing, committed believer. Okay? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, لَيْسَ الْبِرَّ أَن تَوَلُّوا وُجُوهَكُمْ قِبْلَ الْمَشْرِقِ وَالْمَغْرِبِ. Right? That righteousness is not that you simply turn your face right towards the left and the right, meaning in salah. Right? وَلَكِنَّ الْبِرَّ مَنْ آمَنَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ وَالْمَلَائِكَةِ وَالْكِتَابِ وَالنَّبِيِّينَ. So we have this issue in yellow, right? Quickly show. There's beliefs one has to have. That there are a certain set of things one has conviction in. Not just that you say, I believe in it, but you actually understand the consequence of belief in that. So someone who says that, yes, I believe there is a day of judgment, is not the same as someone who understands the reality of what the day of judgment is and what is required to be successful on that day. Or someone who believes in the existence of angels is not like the one who understands why the existence of angels matters for us. And then we get to the other part. وَآتَ الْمَالَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ ذَوِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينَ وَابْنَ السَّبِيلِ وَالسَّائِلِينَ وَفِي الرِّقَابِ. There's also an element of people giving something. That you have to contribute your time, your wealth, your heart, your sweat for the causes of this ummah, for those who are deserving categories, right, of human beings. وَأَقَامَ الصَّلَاةَ وَآتَ الزَّكَاةَ. There's also a certain ritual, spiritual side to this. That things that we have to do, like salah, right, our pillars of worship, right, paying our zakah. وَالْمُوفُونَ بِأَهْدِهِمْ إِذَا عَاهَدُوا. Right, an aspect of character, that we uphold our promises. Right, when we speak a word, do we stand behind that word? This is all part of our deen. وَالصَّابِرِينَ فِي الْبَأْسَاءِ وَالضَّرَّاءِ وَحِينَ الْبَأْسِ. Also, how are we when times are difficult? Are we patient during hardships? Are we patient when we are afflicted with some sort of a hardship in our life? That's a huge part of our Islamic attitude, our tawakkul. أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ صَدَقُوا أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُتَّقُونَ. So Allah says, those are those who are truthful, and it is those people who have true taqwa. So just by looking at this verse, and there's so many hadith we can talk about, we know that religiosity has multiple components. And for one to be a complete believer, right, one has to fulfill all of these dimensions, right, of their practice. So what we try to do at Yaqeen, in our attempt to give the Muslims a better gauge. How many of you have taken a personality quiz before? Do you like taking them? Are you curious to know what you're like? Do you feel like they're accurate? Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, right? So the human being benefits by doing an assessment of themselves. Sometimes you say, I agree, that reflects who I am. Maybe, no, that test is not very good. But it gives you something. And so what we want to do is provide individuals and families an opportunity to say, I want to gauge where I am. Of course, only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala truly can evaluate us on this. But some level of muhasabah, of self-evaluation, is essential. So how do we think about this? So we call this basic, just to kind of simplify it, and I'll tell you what it stands for. This stands for beliefs, attitudes, spirituality, institutional connections, and contributions. You can see the BASIC. Now we're picking these because we believe that these, through looking at the ayat in the Quran and the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, capture a large chunk of the breadth of what it means to be a practicing religious individual. Which means there are a number of beliefs that one has to be committed to. Right? There's beliefs in certain articles of faith, as well as the importance of those beliefs. There are certain attitudes and dispositions, having rida, right, or tawakkul, contentment, satisfaction with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed. Right? There's an aspect of one's spirituality, the quantity that one engages in prayer, Quran reading, dua, tafakkur, and also the quality of it. That when one is engaged in spirituality, what is their connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, their hudur, right, their presence, right, their khushu'a. And then there is a very non-trivial point. So in the Western world today, religion is posited and kind of argued to be a very individualistic thing. My religion is personal, I worship within the confines of my house. But we know in Islam this is not the case. There is the idea of ummah, right? There's an idea that we are a community and we cannot fulfill our ibadah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sitting in our homes. We have to do it in communal spaces. Every single pillar of Islam pretty much is practiced in a group setting to be ideal, right? Salah, the best salah is in the masjid, right? Right? When you give zakat, right, you're giving it right to the community. You're performing hajj at a certain time with a body of believers. In Ramadan, we meet together for iftar, right, and for tarawih. Every single, and even from, if you think about our rites of passage in Islam, every single life event happens in a community. Your child is born, you have an aqiqah, right? Your child is married, right? You have a walima, right? When one passes away, right, you have a janazah. All of these are communal events. So having connections to our communities are fundamentally related to our faith. And the last component is the fact that we have to be a community of givers, of contributors, who do something with our faith. Do we give our time? Do we give our wealth? Right? Do we give our expertise in serving the causes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So one way you can think about it, right? If one wanted to say, how religious are you? And I'm not saying I've captured everything. Of course, there's things that are beyond the means that we can measure. That you could say, well, these are all the different components that fit into one's holistic religiosity. So if someone wanted to say, how religious am I? Well, where am I when it comes to my beliefs? How well do I know my belief system? How well do I internalize it in my day-to-day life? Do I have an attitude of tawakkul? Whether I make money or I lose money, I'm content. Whether I'm sick or I'm healthy, right, I'm grateful to Allah. When bad things happen to me, I understand there's good in them. These are attitudes that are incredibly important. You know, my spiritual behavior and connection, my contribution. So all these contribute, right, to a global sense of religiosity. So what we wanted to do is the belief that the Muslim has, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about, is that religiosity is good for us in this life and the next. This is very, very important because oftentimes people think, and it goes back to yesterday's God image, well, you know what, I have all these things to do in my life, and you know what, I can't do all the fun things. My life would be so much better if I didn't have to follow these rules. But no, we believe the opposite. That actually this practice of ours, everything Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala recommends and commands that we do, everything He forbids or discourages us from doing, all of that is for our benefit. This is a statement of Al-Izz ibn Abdul Salam, beautiful statement. He said, everything Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded or recommended is either good for us in this life, the next life, or both. Everything Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden or discouraged is bad for us in this life, the next life, or in both. So the whole totality of the Sharia is maslahah, is benefit for the human being, which means its manifestation will be seen and observed in this life with a level of tranquility, the level of satisfaction and rida, right, with the level of contentment, even if the worldly circumstances are not ideal. And of course, ultimately, it reflects in success in the akhirah. So we, of course, cannot assess success in akhirah. We can only understand in dunya what's happening to us. So in our attempt to understand how does religion influence our life, which we all care about, everyone who's here today is seeking a better life. Right? We are seeking to have better mental health, better physical health, to raise our kids in a better situation. So how can we capture that? So what we had done in this survey of ours was to ask 4,000 Muslims all over the world questions about their gratitude, their purpose in life, their life satisfaction, their well-being, their anxiety, their depression, the religious doubts that they're having and struggles. And so all of that we're doing, and even like my khutbah on Friday, their attitudes towards uncertainty. And I'll explain why. So we did all of this, and you can see here, to give you a global 40% from North America, almost 30% here from Asia, 20% in Europe, right? The whole world pretty much was accounted for to some level, right? And what we ended up finding, I'll skip through some of this. These are some of the questions, just to give you an idea of how you think about measuring someone's religiosity. We ask questions like, my belief in angels provides my life with little to no meaning to a whole lot of meaning, right? My belief in Islam as absolute truth is not at all certain to absolute certain, right? And there's a whole bunch of questions. You know, we can share this later, inshallah. And so what we wanted to do this for is that we can also categorize people. Just like in a personality profile, you have someone that you can categorize, right, as being kind of this introverted, extroverted, right, a leader, right, or whatever it might be. We wanted to do this with one's religiosity. Can we categorize what type of practice you are engaged in across the dimensions, right, of basic. And just to give you quickly what we found in the global Muslim sample, we found that Muslims generally had a good level of belief, right? There were no problems with accepting the belief in Allah, the day of judgment, of the angels, and commitment to those things. We found specifically their spiritual connection wasn't too high, and then their connections to their communities and contributing was probably on the low side. Just to kind of give you some background into this. But you could take all of these and add them up to give every individual a total score of how religious they were. And to give you again some more background, out of these 4,000 people, you could classify 8 of them as being kind of very low in their religiosity, right? 8%. About half, you'd say, were medium in their religiosity, and you'd say almost 40% were high in their religiosity. Now keep in mind, this is a more religious sample you typically find because we recruited them right through yaqeen. And so just to summarize, and I'll show you some numbers, that we found that people who scored higher on this holistic religiosity measure, sure enough, reported substantially higher levels of well-being and gratitude, substantially higher level of life satisfaction, and a greater sense of purpose in life. And the way you could think about this is if I took those 3 categories, right, I had a low person, a medium person, and a high person, and I wanted to give them a score, right, if someone was in the low category, you can see their life satisfaction score was quite low, 43%, well-being was only about 50%, so all these were 50% or lower, which is not very good on a scale of 1 to 5. Then you had people who were in the middle, you can see their numbers start to go up in the 60% to 70%, and then those who were highly religious were all between 75 and about 90% on these things. You can clearly see that there's a correlation between their religiosity and well-being outcomes in their lives. Now you could think about the inverse as well. What about the bad things that we want to avoid in life? So when we speak about mental health or well-being, there's 2 things to speak about. One of them is thriving. So one wants to have a life of not just, I don't want to be anxious or depressed, but I want to be thriving in life. I want to really feel like I have vitality, that I have energy, that I have a purpose, right? I have this energy towards doing good. That's what we mean by well-being here. And then you have the opposite, which is psychopathology. Right? Psychopathology is more of like anxiety, schizophrenia, depression, kind of maladaptive mental illnesses, right? And so what we found is that those who were more religious had less religious doubt, less depression, and less anxiety as well. And we again can quantify that. Keep in mind this was gathered during the pandemic, so these numbers of anxiety and depression are actually elevated because they were during the pandemic. So you see the people who were low in religiosity had an incredibly high rate of anxiety and depression. About 40%, 4 in 10, you would say met a clinical threshold for having an anxiety disorder or depression disorder. And their doubts, right, were almost 32% on the scale, right, of 1 to 100. And you see those who got more religious, you see how their numbers got better and better. So the highly religious people had substantially lower rates of depression and anxiety and lower rates of religious doubt. Now I'm saying all of this to be very clear that religion itself does not eliminate mental illness and psychopathology. But what it does is it has a correlation and it helps reduce and actually helps overcome it faster. And the best analogy I can give is to physical fit health. If somebody is physically fit here and they exercise and they play sports and they lift weights, can they still get injured? They can get injured. But do they get injured? Do they recover fast? They recover faster often if they're more physically fit, right? So physical fitness is something we aspire for, but even the fit can get injured. But the likelihood of injury often is lower for them because of their fitness. The same thing with mental well-being, like those who are religious have a higher baseline level of mental well-being, while they still, right, will have setbacks in life, just like any other human being, but they will recover typically at faster rates. Why? Because they have better coping mechanisms. Why? Because they have a certain worldview that allows them to conquer these challenges much faster. And so I'm here to be very clear that being religious will not solve, right, all mental health problems. It can simply help in relation to a whole lot of other treatment that's required. So that's just to give you an overview, just to kind of establish that religiosity has these numerous factors. And by the way, I didn't explain this, but if I went back here and I simply used how often you go to the masjid, or I used simply your frequency of prayer, it would not be half as predictive. So using a bad conception of religiosity really muddies our understanding of the effect of our faith, right, on our life. So now you can think about it. Let's move a little bit. And let's say I don't want to just give you a score from 1 to 100. I want to give you a classification, like your personality classification. And that's because there are people who might have really good beliefs, but let's say not good practice. Or people who are really active in the community, but maybe their beliefs are not very good. So it's like you could have a combination of things, right? So what does that look like, and why does that matter to us? So I took here our beliefs, our attitudes, our spirituality, institutional connections, and contributions, and I put them all together to give the individual a profile. And what we found was that some people fell into, we'll have these profiles, this one. What you see here is that they're pretty high in their beliefs and their attitudes, and they're very low when it comes to their institutional connections and their contribution, which means they're personally very religious, not religious in any community sense, right? They don't give back, they don't volunteer, they're not really a part of the community at all. Yet another group who you find again is similar in terms of they have higher beliefs, right? But they've got quite a bit lower in their attitudes. They're actually very practicing when it comes to, they read Quran, right? They pray Fajr on time, they do all their 5 prayers, but that's kind of it. Everything else is pretty low other than their beliefs. So we call this the ritually practicing only group. And so you can see that there's really not much more happening other than I pray and I read Quran in my life. There was a group that was good at everything. We call them holistically religious. So in all the categories, they seem to be fulfilling a high level of practice. And then there was a couple more, right? This one was medium in their practice. We had a medium group. And then we had a group that was high in everything except for connection to the community. So they're like, in every way they're religious, but they're kind of disenfranchised with the community. So I'll summarize that here, just to show it to you. You can see down here we have these 6 categories. They're high in their personal practice, low in their community practice. There's those who are ritually only, holistically religious, low religiosity, religious but disconnected from a community, and medium religiosity. So now we want to wonder, which group is the best? And which group is in the middle, and which group is the lowest? And you can think about yourself, and your family, and your children, and say, well, where do we fall in this? And how does that affect our own lives? And what you find, so first thing I'll do is just give you a breakdown. That in our study, we found that about 17% were in that kind of high individual religiosity, but kind of low communal. 12% were just the ritually practicing, but another 13% were just in the low group. And you see that distribution. 21% were holistically religious. And here, if I just show you, I know there's a lot of numbers here, but this is actually pretty surprising when we found it. What you ended up finding, actually it's probably easier to show you here, is by well-being. So again, now here I'm going to show you the life satisfaction, the purpose in life, and the well-being are the 3 bars, right? Well-being, purpose in life, right, and well-being. Life satisfaction first. You find that in this well-being, 2 groups scored the lowest. And those were the low religiosity group, which we've already talked about. But also we found those that were only engaged in ritual practice. It means they just do their salah and they read Quran, but they were low in their beliefs and attitudes, connection to the community, and contribution, were functionally as low, which is very surprising. And out of academic honesty, I wanted to speak about this with everyone today. So we're not here to discourage people that, if you pray and you read Quran, there's no benefit. Inshallah, there's benefit in the akhirah. But somebody who doesn't have a commitment to seeking the proper beliefs and internalizing the correct attitudes and being a part of a community will not reap the benefits of deen in their dunya. Inshallah, Allah accepts whatever someone has given, has done, and accepts it in the akhirah. But in this life, those people have very little, they have low levels of well-being and high levels, right, of the bad stuff. Again, you can see here, when it came to the negative outcomes, those who are ritually practicing only were very similar to those who are not very religious. They had higher levels of doubt, high levels of depression, high levels of anxiety. And again, only the holistically religious group, right, scored the lowest on all these things. So you can see that those who were like religious but disconnected, they actually did have a fair amount of anxiety. And this is important because today we are living in a time where in the Western world has never been as lonely as it is today. I was just looking at some numbers. In the mid-70s, half of men in society had 6 close, intimate friends that they could count on and they could talk to openly about their life. And they just did the numbers again today, and they say it's 25%. And I just did a study, Sheikh Muhammad was there, I presented on imams, and even with imams, about 1 in 4 don't have one close friend that they can speak to about their personal life that's going on. So there is a loneliness epidemic in the world today. Everyone goes to work, especially if they work from home, and they sit on their computer and they watch Netflix and they're busy with their family, and there really is no need to interact with other people. And this has really led to a breakdown, right, in people's lives. It increases anxiety, increases depression, because we are the insan, right? One of the roots of insan is, right, from the, that we have this desire to relate with one another, right? From al-uns, right? So part of this is that you cannot fulfill that well-being unless you are actually being in a space with people who you care deeply about. So coming to the masjid for salah, right, coming to community events and mingling is not only, right, religiously rewarded, but also is incredibly good for your well-being. And so staying at home, I know Sheikh Muhammad was speaking earlier today about the rise in, now it's very comfortable. You can sit at your laptop and you can say, well, why should I go to the masjid for the lecture? I can listen to any sheikh in the world and I can catch a lecture. It doesn't bring the same benefit, neither in the knowledge nor in the connection of the hearts. So being a part of a community cannot be fulfilled, and you cannot get the benefits of it through some sort of online presence. And so essentially what we ended up finding, just to go back to this chart, was that the more religious you get, almost in a linear way, right, the better your positive outcomes are there, and you get less of the bad stuff essentially, right? Now I want to show a few things that are important for us to think about, which is how age comes into this. I want to transition slowly to speaking about our youth. So we did find that younger people were less religious globally than older people, and that again follows global trends of religiosity. And that's a concern, that as Muslims in the West, that our children are at risk of having lower religiosity than we have. But then it goes back to, you might wonder why. And we're going to get a little bit into this. So again, doubts, you see that younger people, 18 to 24, had triple the doubts of people who were 35 and up pretty much, right? So it's a higher level, not astronomical, it's only 18%, but still, it's non-trivial to say that there's 3 times more doubts in young people than there are in older people. So I wanted to understand, why is this the case? What is the root cause of some of these doubts? And like I mentioned on Friday in the khutbah, this psychological inflexibility is, in my opinion, one of the root causes. So we asked people general questions about how well do you tolerate uncertainty in life? So the questions were like, uncertainty makes life intolerable, right? Or I don't like it when I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And you see that young people here, between 18 and about 34, had higher levels of saying we hate uncertainty in our life than the older people, who are a lot more tolerant of it. And you'd say, well, what's the connection? The connection was that those people who are high in uncertainty have a whole lot more religious doubt. Right? So you'd say these questions had nothing to do with religion. My questions to do with general uncertainty, intolerance, and then separate questions on religious doubt. And you're finding that those people who are spiritually and intellectually inflexible apply the inflexibility to their faith, and it really causes them a lot of anguish and problems. Skip this for a minute. Skip. Oh, so this, for those who wanted to see some details, just to know. So we wanted to, if we want to predict and understand well-being in our community, you can look here and you get an idea about what really matters. So people might say, well, it's money. If you have more money, you'll have better mental health or more education or so on and so forth. So what we find is that younger people, this is depression. Younger people have more depressive symptoms. Women have slightly higher depressive symptoms than men. Having education as well, right, decreases depression a little bit. Marriage decreases depressive symptoms as well. But you see that the largest predictor right here for depression is uncertainty and tolerance. So the more uncertainty and tolerant someone is of the world, the higher likelihood of having depression is. And you see here, religion has an effect, that the more religious you are, the less depressive symptoms you have, and the more religious doubts you have, the more depressive symptoms that you have. And the same thing you can see for anxiety, it's a very similar pattern. And for well-being, you can see it's the opposite way, that religion is by far the biggest predictor of having a purpose in life. Religion is by far the biggest predictor of life satisfaction. So more than your education, more than being married, right, more than any other factor, one's holistic religiosity contributes to their life satisfaction, as well as their holistic well-being. So, I hope I've been able to make a convincing argument here that religion is the pivotal factor, not the only factor, but one of the most central factors of well-being in life. Whereas actually for psychopathology, it is simply one of many possible things, right? Like I go back to showing you this. It's not the biggest factor if you look at depression, right, or anxiety here. Sorry. Sorry. Yeah. Can you bring the presentation again? Yeah, Jazakallah khair. Okay. So what I want to move to now is speaking a little bit about youth, because we're seeing in the youth in America a rise in mental health problems. We're also seeing a rise or a decrease in religiosity. And we are trying to understand at Yaqeen how to fix this problem. So we did a survey of about 300 Muslim youth who came mainly through ICNA. You know, that was the means of recruiting these youth who are part of some ICNA circle. And we were able to find some of the major predictors of their well-being and even of their religiosity. So without a doubt, parents were the biggest predictors of religiosity, like we've been speaking about. The way that the parents spoke to the children, the relationship with the children, that was a key thing that would predict how religious their children were. But what we show here is that some of the factors that parents might want to think about when it comes to, I want my child to have good thriving, high levels of thriving and low levels of any sort of illness, is that we found that sleep was a huge factor, meaning sleep quality. Many of the youth in the community today, we know that our teenagers especially stay up very late on the phones or very late on the computers, and they wake up very early for school. This was found to be actually very highly correlated with their mental health. So if you have children in the room here, that it's not trivial for young children from all the way until they're adults, even into adulthood, that they get a proper good night's sleep. And if they don't, right, you can't replace that with religiosity, you can't replace it with anything else. That is just going to do a number on them. So good sleep hygiene is a huge predictor, right, of their well-being in this case, right? The other thing that mattered a whole lot was youth having high quality peer relationships. And not surprisingly, we found the case that a lot of youth actually had very low quality peer relationships. Again, going back to the phenomena, many Muslim parents, in being protective of their kids, often do not allow their kids to socialize with many youth. And adolescence is a time where the adolescent brain is craving human relationships. So if we withhold our children from having meaningful relationships in their teenage years, then that's going to affect their well-being at very, very high levels. Now it's a dilemma, because if we put them in circles that are not healthy, although they might feel good with their friends, it has an effect of possibly negative religiosity, right? And negative impact on religious doubts. The other thing you can see again is even for teenagers, the biggest predictor of their well-being was religiosity here. You can see that. Don't worry about the numbers, but the magnitude of it. So if you wanted to say what's the predictor of a young teenager having good mental health, when it comes to thriving, it was religiosity being the number one. And then again, you found for youth, uncertainty and tolerance was a big predictor of low levels, right, of thriving. So there's so much we can go into. I want to give a lot of time for Q&A today. But the big finding that we're coming up with again is that parents are the central cogs that drive how kids see the world. They're the ones who give them the belief system and the coping mechanisms. In the study here, we added coping mechanisms. And children who had good parental relationships had very good coping mechanisms, which means they knew how to deal with the hardships that came up in life because their parents had modeled that for them properly. That when things happen to you, this is how we react, this is how we exercise patience, this is how we control our anger, right? So on and so forth. The last thing that I can say that goes beyond the means of this study was talking about their general religiosity. What do we know from the research? Is that a few things matter a lot. We talked about parents in detail. Peers matter a lot, not just for their well-being, but for their religiosity. That the more religious one's peers are, right, the more religious that your children are going to be, because there's a contagion effect. And the less religious one's peers are, the less religious they're going to be, and the likelihood of substance abuse and trying things like drugs and cigarettes, that goes up with peer circles that are engaging in that more so. The third thing to speak about that's really important is mass media. So within mass media, we're talking about social media usage, talking about smartphone usage, talking about gaming, movies. What we're finding is that youth who spend more time on these social media sites have lower levels again of religiosity. Children who watch rated R movies, this has been documented through adolescence. So a teenager who watches rated R movies, by the time he's at the end of his teenage years, has diminished religiosity typically. And we're finding that exposure to Islamophobia through media as well. So the more Islamophobic messages the kids are seeing through TV and through media, right, that also makes them want to appear to be less religious. So they don't want to be exposed to that Islamophobia, of course. And the last thing to speak about is higher education. So for parents thinking about their kids' college attainment. College is a really, really tricky time in youth religiosity because college professors tend to not appear to be religious. Even though many of them believe in God, there is a certain pressure in academia to not appear to be religious. And so children go into the university looking up to their professors. And they're very influenced by that. They say, well, if none of my professors, they talk about God, or, and that's best case, they don't talk about him, but oftentimes they speak low about religion and they ridicule religion, then that's going to influence their own belief system. Second of all, in the university, there's a belief that's called scientism that is promoted. And so in a university, the belief is what? There's no objective truth except for science. Every single department pretty much in a university subscribes to this. Every hard science, right? Biology, social sciences, they all believe in this. So you cannot have truth outside of a scientific method. And that also makes children who are going through this program devalue that whatever a scripture could come up with. And so what we typically find is that people don't dump their religion in college, but the general finding is that they negotiate with it. They say, well, I believe in God and I believe in my religion, but their belief in the supernatural diminishes. And they try to find some interpretation like, okay, you know, maybe like angels are metaphorical, right? Maybe jinn are metaphorical, and you try to kind of reinterpret this to fit within your scientific realm. So when your kids go to college, it's incredibly important to think about having proper spaces, Muslim spaces for your kids to go to. I always tell this to parents, and I teach in the university. I'm very connected with the university system in California. If you go and you check out a college, see if there's an MSA. See if they have a prayer space. See what the Muslim community there is like. And that should be as important of a factor for a parent as the ranking of the university, the quality of their department that your kid wants to go into, the prestige of the university, because we see it. Parents who send their kids to these elite Ivy League schools, other schools, and they feel great when their kid is 18, and they're crying when the kid is 21 and says, I don't believe in God anymore, or my religious practice, right, has pretty much diminished substantially. So higher education really is a point in life where people really solidify their beliefs. So these years are central in either taking them to be stronger in their faith, right, or in being weaker. So there's a whole lot more I can go to. I wanted to stop at 8:30, so we have a full 25 minutes for Q&A. I'll stop here, and we can, inshallah, we can open it up, bi'idhnillah. So, yes, brother. Sure. Yeah, Jazakallah khair. So I will email the presentation to Sheikh Muhammad, and he's welcome to share that with you all. If you also go to yaqeeninstitute.org, we have 2 papers on this, actually 3 papers. If you type in basic, or if you type in, let's see what else, like holistic religiosity, all these papers will come up. So I'll actually email them all to Sheikh Muhammad, and he can have them all accessible to each of you. Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes, a very good question. So this study actually is under peer review right now at a mental health journal. So the question was, how do we convince other people about this? It's easy for us to believe in it because we're Muslims. What about non-Muslims and other skeptical Muslims? So all of these studies, by the way, at Yaqeen, they get peer reviewed. So they go out to other experts who look at it, who criticize them, who say there might be errors, and they correct them. And also it's at a journal. So right now it's at a journal. Inshallah, in the next month or 2, we'll get a response back. And once it gets published, inshallah, then that's on the record. But by the way, you don't need this study. If you look at the body of literature on religion and well-being, the overwhelming evidence from non-Muslims as well is that religiosity is a protective factor from depression, right, other mental health problems, and supports in thriving. Now what we're showing here is that the better we measure religiosity in a holistic sense, the much stronger that effect is going to be. So inshallah, in a few months you can read the published version of this, inshallah. Yeah. Oh, Oh, so sorry, just to be clear, so this bar in the middle, if anything is overlapping, then it's not a predictor. It's not significant. So in our study, young people and women had no difference. So however, wherever you were in adolescence didn't matter, and whether you're a male or a female, it did not affect your well-being levels, right? Yeah. Only if it's outside of that. So those are the kind of the error bars. Yeah. Because there's always something, a margin of error essentially we're getting, right? So, yes. Yes, so his question was, people who spend their nights on their phone and then who wake up early, they have worse mental health? Yes. They have more anxiety, they have higher rates of depression, and lower levels of well-being. Because your brain is exhausted and you're unable to function, and your body, your muscles and everything haven't gotten the rest they need, right, to be performing at their optimal level. So, sleep early, turn off the phone, right? Parents, smartphones, there should be a hard rule. My opinion is no smartphones, but if that's too hard for you, they need to be out of the room and in your possession after a time that you have decided. And usually, as well with sleep, if they go to bed at 10 and you turn off the phone at 10, that's bad. Because the blue light that's being emitted from these devices is actually going to mess with their circadian rhythm. So they should be taken away many hours actually before the bedtime, right? Yes? That's okay. Yeah, great question. His question is there research that talks about a safer age to have cell phones? To be very honest, the research on cell phones is so all over the place because of how fast things are changing. So they'll do these studies, let's say like a couple years ago, and then like by the time it gets published, the whole nature of cell phones, the apps that are there, all we know is that early adoption of these social media sites is incredibly detrimental to youth mental health, especially for girls. So again, I want to repeat that. The effect of social media is substantially worse for women than it is for men, because for the young women, right, there's a sexualization that's going on in this process, and they are being evaluated very quickly based upon their looks, and that causes even more anguish, right, and pain, right, than it does for the men who are involved. So apps are the worst. I mean, using like TikTok and these things are the worst for one's well-being. If you need to use a phone, again, use a phone that can only make phone calls. Having no data is optional because it's like playing with fire for an adolescent. The brain in adolescence is wired for thrill-seeking. It is wired for thrill-seeking. Your brain of your teenager has shut off the part of the brain that tells it to fear things. So its amygdala's not functioning the way mine does and yours does. So they are going to look for thrills not because they're bad, because their brain is wired that way. So if you give them a chance to do that, they will explore that. So you have to be responsible by cutting off some of those pathways so you can prevent that from happening right outside right of your attention. Right? Yes, brother. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, great question. So it goes, what criteria is involved for understanding the parents? This particular measure in this study was the parent-youth relationship. So the child is reporting how good their relationship is with their mom and their dad. And I had moms and dads separate, and then I combined them. So it's how warm and loving is my mom to me? How well do I get along with my mother or father? There's a whole battery of questions. So it's in the study, right? You can pull it up, but that's an existing scale. And mostly the other scales, it's almost the same thing. They'll talk about the things a parent does with the child, the parental socialization. My mom or dad speak to me about, you know, faith, if it's religious socialization. But all of them have to do with the quality of this relationship. And so even in the religious literature, having religious parents does not produce religious children unless the religious parents are effective in building a healthy relationship. So, because children want to model people who they look up to. So if that relationship with mom and dad is one of love and respect, and it's one of I desire to emulate them, then what the parents do is going to transmit to the child. And if it's one of, well, my mom and dad are religious, but I don't like my mom and dad, then they're actually going to rebel away from that. So that quality is more important than any other aspect, right, of parenting. Yes, brother. Yes. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah. Yep, yep.
And related to that, something specific here from the West, which is there even something thinking specific to the fact that young children here are, most of them are first or second generation?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. So the first question was, how do we make sure the data is not biased? So I'm not going to make any claims, actually. This is not to say this represents the ummah. But when you do actually correlational studies, it doesn't matter. Because even if this sample is skewed to be religious, the correlations you see are still real. So even if you say they're more religious than the average population of Muslims, right, we're saying that, well, still within that sample, more religiosity predicts, right, better mental health. So actually this is a conservative estimate. If I got a more general sample of less practicing Muslims, the effect of religiosity would be actually even larger, right? The second question you had was on the generational status. We did not account for that in these studies, but there is good evidence in the literature that each generation actually has less and less of their parental values in them than the prior generation, right? So if you think about religiosity, likely second and third generations will be less religious than the first generation that migrated. But I don't have that in this study, right? Allahu A'lam, right? Yeah. And make sure that if the sisters have questions, please let me know somehow, right? Yeah, great question. These are practical recommendations for the loneliness epidemic we have. So the most obvious one is that, inshallah, we acknowledge that the Muslim community is our first and foremost community to be a part of. Which doesn't mean, right, there's not other community spaces we can be a part of. But by simply attending the masjid, not just for salah, again, this is important, you can come for salah, but typically it's men who come for salah and they leave. But families coming here and saying this is a place that we regularly frequent to build relationships is the most practical advice I can give. Because that is going to build lasting friendships, which is what we need for our children. That I come here on a Friday, or I come here for a youth group, or I come here whenever there's a program for kids. And even if your kids are running around and playing like right now, they're not doing anything religious. They're playing if they're in babysitting. This is good. This is giving them that I enjoy being in the company of other Muslims. Hopefully they go home and say, Mama, I played with Ahmed. Can you call Ahmed's mom so we can play with Ahmed? Right? And we start to work on that. That's one thing. The second thing, though, is the general community. We also want our children to feel like they belong to the world they live in. So immersing them in environments that we know are safe. So putting them in sports, right? Putting them in spaces where they make friends that are maybe not part of our Muslim community who they can connect with. Because we also want them to feel like they're Americans, right? You can't be like, well, I'm this completely isolated oddball because I don't know anything about the mainstream society. So a healthy level of immersion with the non-Muslims in good spaces, but predominantly the friendships need to be centered with the Muslim community, right? Allahu A'lam, right? Yes, brother.
So you see a lot of uncertainty, tolerance,
Yeah.
causing, negative mental health, right? So how do you instill even within adults or
Yeah.
within kids how to adapt to uncertainty and not have that fear?
Yeah, great question. So a couple of things. So one, if there's something clinical where someone has an extreme level of anxiety, paranoia, and depression, these need proper treatment as well. You need to go and see a psychologist, a psychiatrist to help at least understand. And they will understand whether it falls into the domain of requiring some sort of medication, which may be the case because there are genetic factors, environmental factors, or if it requires therapy. So some common sense things that I would just encourage everyone, good practices. Something as simple, like I said on a Friday, is turning off your phone, leaving your phone at home when you're running an errand. So you're going to go run to the grocery store. How many of you would be comfortable leaving your phone at home if you were going to grocery shopping for a few hours? Right? Some of you. How many of you would not be comfortable? Right? Most people, right? Why? Because we become so accustomed to these things that we fear if we don't have it that, well, what's going to happen? What if someone needs me? What if my child needs me? What if my mom needs me? What if, right? This is actually a clinical treatment. You turn off your phone, you leave it in the house, you go run your errands for a few hours, which again requires you now to know where you're going, so which is good for your mind and your memory. You map things out and you say, okay, I'm going to go to this store and this store and this store. You go, you come home, and you journal about how that felt. And you say, okay, you know what? That was paralyzing when I left the house without my phone for 2 hours. I went, and maybe every 5 minutes you're checking, is my phone here, right? And you come back home and you write down, say, how did that experience feel? And it allows you actually to process this and say, you know what? It was really paralyzing at first, but actually nothing happened in the end. And that builds confidence to say, you know what? I can tolerate not knowing what is going to happen. So simple things like this, turning off your GPS when you're going somewhere that you already know how to go to. It just builds that, okay, there's traffic. Sheikh was coming to pick me up from the airport the other day. He got stuck in an hour and 3 hour traffic jam. He couldn't get me. What happened? Khalas, it's just, I don't know. Right? So this is, and it goes again back to, a belief system has to underlie this. This is not random. When everything happens that you did not expect, what is your attribution? Why do you think that happened? Now, is it the world is random, and so this is just randomness I have to deal with? Or there is a hikmah, there is a wisdom, that everything that happens, happens because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed it, and there's something that I can gain from this experience. Which now takes away the pain of anything happening that's aversive. So okay, I got stuck in traffic for 3 hours. Okay, what can I do? First, I can't control the qadr, but what can I control? Maybe this is a chance for me to learn sabr. Can I sit quietly? Can I review my Quran? Can I turn on a podcast of something beneficial, right? There's something you can gain from that if you attribute it to, again, a positive image of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Allah wants some khair for me in this. He wants me to learn something from this. He's trying to build resilience in me, right? So attributing things to the proper means, right, is a central part of tolerating. Or else, if you don't have a belief system, then none of this stuff makes sense. It absolutely makes no sense. You'd say, well, it just could be because there's no reason this happened. So how do you gain wisdom from things that have no purpose behind them, right? So, yes?
So just more,
Yeah.
just want to maybe clarify your answer.
Yeah.
A little bit back to you. So essentially what you're saying is like by going to like maybe the grocery store with yourself, you feel that certainty,
Mm-hmm.
or you feel that your phone gives you that
Yes.
certainty in case something happens, but then to leave it at home and then to see that hey, nothing happened and you're good, and that would kind of
It builds some tolerance.
yeah, it builds some tolerance towards certainty. So it's like I guess like a little exercise.
Yes.
Kind of builds up like a muscle.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And second thing, like I really think we should try to like reach out to the sisters and see if they have questions.
We're trying. We're trying. Are there questions on the sister side? No questions? Okay. We are asking, so let's come here first. Yes, that's a great question. So in my opinion, they're deeply, deeply related. And if you do a correlation, there is. So is there a correlation between tawakkul, trusting in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and uncertainty and tolerance? And my answer is theoretically yes. Because if one has true tawakkul, true tawakkul of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they will have better tolerance for that. Now, if you do a correlation between our measure of attitude, which is a measure of tawakkul, like the questions were whether I make money or lose money, I'm content with what Allah has decreed, is questions like that. You do see that it correlates very, very strongly. So this desire for control, right, is a human tendency, which in many ways is the opposite of tawakkul, which is relinquishing control. And just a fascinating study to give you some insight into, they actually did a brain scan of people who recited in salah, after salah, right, during the salah, they're scanning their brain, right, and what they found is that through salah, they actually found the part of the brain that's seeking control in the prefrontal cortex to be diminished, which means a person in salah is supposed to be relinquishing control to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So salah is a practice as well, if you do it with the right understanding. Right? This is a way that say, you know what, Allah, like the universe is in your hands, right? Whatever you have destined for me, whatever you command me towards, right, I accept. This is a way that one builds his tawakkul and builds their uncertainty in tolerance, right? Wallahu a'lam, right? Yeah. Yes, brother.
Just first off, this is great stuff, so just for your time.
Wa yakum.
Just more of a next step sort of question.
Yeah.
When you come up with that basic score
Yeah.
system, are you planning on like extending that to messages to like try to
Yeah. Yeah, great question. Yeah, is that the only question? Okay. So the question is like, what are some of the next steps? So yes, our goal at Yaqeen is to operationalize this tool as an assessment for individuals and for communities. So in the near future, inshallah, if you go to Yaqeen in the next few months, it will prompt you, would you like to take your basic survey? And you can choose that, yes, I want to take it, and it'll spit you back a report that says this is where you're at in all these domains. Then it'll give you recommendations based on our algorithm that says, well, if you need to improve in your beliefs and in your attitudes, you'll get Sheikh Muhammad's papers that he's written, right? And all the different domains, right? You'll get that. But more importantly, also, we want to give this. Imams requested this. So if you're the imam of a masjid, you can send out a link to your entire community. They can take the survey, and then that will come back. And we'll see, okay, where are our weak points? What should we be teaching? What should we be speaking about? Right? If there's a weakness in institutional connection, well, why is that, right? So for us, it's meant to be a diagnostic tool that everything is public and freely available. So it's just something which anyone can, hopefully people take it and they do things with it. Hopefully build on it, right? It's all open source and out there. So that's the goal, right? Yes, brother. Yes. Yeah, so right now we've just weighed them equally, just for the sake of making it easy. But one could imagine that some are heavier than others. But I think for giving someone like a bird's eye view, it just helps to make them all even for them, right? So, yeah.
I'm interested to see the viewers' comments, not on the statistical analysis, but on the finding itself. Where they're comments, non-Muslims.
Oh, the non-Muslims. So when we get back the journal reviews, we'll see that. All right. So probably need about a month. But I have discussed this with a lot of non-Muslim colleagues, and I've actually called. So there is a study that was done. If you look it up, anyone is interested in the subject of religion in America, there's a study that was called NSYR, National Study of Youth and Religion. So this followed. It was $12 million study funded by some Christian endowments to study the state of Christianity in America, and that individual, Christian Smith is his name, a professor, he was very generous with his time. He gave me a few hours for me to think about how to measure the Muslim community as well. And they've written like a dozen books. And all their studies, again, point to this very same phenomena. And in fact, he told me himself, because we know that we were the first to do this. And there's so many holes in it. And he says the things that you're suggesting will probably plug in a whole lot of these holes. His one suggestion was, don't start with teenagers, start with young kids. Because they started with teenagers. And the belief is that this process is probably far more instilled very, very early on. The problem is measuring young children is very tough to give them a survey at 5 years old and 6 years old, right? But the non-Muslims who have seen this say that this is just in line with what we have found as well. But it seems to be even cleaner because we're benefiting from what they have done, right? You know, hikmah dalatul mu'min, right? We whatever good somebody does, we build off of it, right? So, yeah.
There's a question on
Yes.
someone said recommend parents and resources, books, and so on.
Are there recommendations for parenting resources? We have some articles on Yaqeen if one goes that in the next month or two there should be a few that come out. So maybe there are some good ones you can look at. That's probably the best thing that I have right now. There really isn't a lot of... So we have a video series by Sheikh Ibrahim Hindi on prophetic parenting as well. Those might be some resources that people benefit from. Right. I think someone... Did you have a hand? No. We had one earlier. Oh, yes. Sorry.
For our kids to get through college and university, better religious, mental health, what is the best advice to give?
One more time. For our children to get to college? Through college. Yes.
In a better state.
Yes. Okay, good. So what is the advice to give our children to get through college in a better state, right? Well, the best advice I can give is make sure that if they don't live at home, they have Muslim roommates. Very, very early on, find some good Muslim roommates, get 4, brothers or 4 sisters, right, in an apartment together, right? That is going to create that environment in the household that, if one of them gets up for Fajr, maybe they'll help the other one. There's some social event in the MSA or religious event, they drag one another. That is huge. Second advice, this may not be popular, do not study Islam in college from non-Muslims. I openly say that with no qualms. If you're going to go and study at the undergraduate level, and you have not studied a foundation from a Muslim, if you have not learned your aqidah and your fiqh and your tazkiyah and these basic sciences and your seerah from a proper Muslim source, now you go to the university, you're just going to mess up your entire religiosity. And even if it's a Muslim teaching it, half the time you don't want that Muslim teaching you, right? So you better vet that person if it's a Muslim teaching it, but typically just avoid the academic study of Islam in undergraduate settings. If one attains a high level of Islamic literacy and they want to pursue higher studies, that's a separate topic. But learn your deen from Muslims in Muslim spaces before you ever expose yourself to it in non-Muslim spaces. Right? That'd be my advice. Wallahu a'lam. Right? Yeah. So I'll come back. I know someone. Yes, we had it.
Are there recommendations on how to handle peer pressure for your kids? For example, they might say, so-and-so having school.
Yeah. Yeah, his question is very good. It's how do you handle peer pressure with peers? So if peers feel like their friends are doing certain things or they have certain things, how do you talk to them about it? It's kind of like we spoke about yesterday. There's no easy answers to this. all of this depends on a decade prior of parenting relationship, is how strong is that relationship with your child. So when they come to you with these, that you have the ability to walk them through and make a decision that you want them to do. So in this case, you also have to negotiate. Sometimes there will be peer pressure, and sometimes your child may give in, or is really going to struggle not to give in. And knowing that when do you really push and put your foot down versus saying, you know what, I don't want my kid to do this, but you know what, maybe they need to learn from some sort of experience in these cases, right? You have to be very, very judicious in defining for yourself what are your boundaries. But a few things. So the one we spoke about earlier is that our children, more than we need to know. In the last generation, we know this. The adults in this room, likely, when they were young, if you asked your parents, why do we do something? First of all, that wasn't even a question you asked. And if you were to ask it, you might get smacked upside the head, right? It's like, no, we don't ask why. You just do it because you're supposed to do it, right? That was our method of parenting. That was a method of conveying deen. That does not work with this generation because the entire culture is about questioning everything, not just religion, right? Even like, well, why do I have to brush my teeth, right? It's not about deen. It's just, you know, this is the way our kids are raised now. So if you're not prepared to answer the why, well, why can't I go and hang out? Everyone else is hanging out. Why can't I have a smartphone? Why can't I have a TikTok account? If you just say, well, because I said so, that's not going to get you very far. It'll create a lot of resentment. So you really have to walk them through why you don't want them to have it. So even if they end up doing it, they still know that this is why we're not supposed to do it. And so they will still do some of these things. But at least you've told them this is why we don't do it. And hopefully, if they end up doing it, they'll say, all right, that was a bad idea, and now I understand that my dad was right. Which helps because it builds that bank in their head that I need to trust my mom and my dad because they're making sense when they're explaining the rules to me, right? And the other suggestion is the more alternatives you have, that, well, there's so many other friend circles, and there's so many other friends who are not doing the things that you don't want your kid to do, then it's much more likely. Alhamdulillah, I'm very blessed in this regard, right? You know, we have a very good circle of friends for my teenage daughter, and that we always keep her in the circle of, I wouldn't say extremely like-minded parents, we have similar values. So, like, only one of her friends has a smartphone out of, like, 15 friends. So it's much easier for, my daughter doesn't come home and say, well, all my friends have a smartphone, right? Or all my friends have a TikTok, or all my friends are going to the movie to watch this rated R movie. That doesn't happen for the most part. So we've reduced the likelihood of the peer pressure by making sure she's in a better group of friends. Now it doesn't eliminate it, it just makes it a little bit easier, right? So, wallahu alam, right? Someone who was, yes, over there. Sisters, are there questions? No, nothing yet? Okay, Fadl. Yeah. Yeah. Great question. So there's no real large body of data on that subject. Inshallah, we're planning to do that in the coming years. But we've found, at least in our limited studies, is that more religious education in general is a better predictor of religiosity and less doubt. Now that doesn't mean we didn't get to public school, because the numbers are incredibly low of frequency of Muslim kids who go outside of a public school setting. So there's no data set that I know that exists that has a large number of kids who are not in a public school system. So inshallah, in a few years, we can answer that question. Now, the trend that we see anecdotally is that the children who attend public schools, as the society gets more and more liberal, are going to have more and more doubts, because they're going to be presented with those doubts much earlier on, right? But there's no hard evidence on that I have seen. Wallahu a'lam, right? So, we have a couple more minutes. Aisha's 9, right? Okay. We have 3-4 more minutes for questions, inshallah. Yes. Alaikum salam.
So, I guess the conclusion that we're trying to, or we might say as Muslims, by seeing the correlation between religiosity and well-being, we might say, okay, look, we prove that religion brings well-being and therefore everything is solved. But a skeptic might say that sometimes believing in, you're asking them to believe in something that's not true, sometimes believing in something that's not true will give you comfort.
Sure. Yeah, great question. So his question is, well, essentially you can believe in something that's not true and have a positive effect, right? That is possible. That's a whole separate conversation that we have to get back to. But I would say that for a skeptical person, I would tell them, look at all the things that are being captured here, individually even. So we know that, for instance, being part of a community, religious or not, is good for one's well-being, right? We know that actually giving All the literature on nonprofit management and philanthropy and psychology says that people who give, actually, it improves your well-being. Right? So we know individually all these things have been proven to be beneficial for the person. The beauty is that Islam has put them all together in a system for you. So rather than saying, well, I've got to go and pull, this way of being in order to get this benefit and this thing, it's been packaged for you. And to ask that person, say, okay, how has this been packaged for us, 1400 years ago, before modern science figured any of this stuff out? So we have to actually, I personally believe, be on the offensive with people. People expect us to be very defensive. Well, let me tell you why Islam is not bad. Well, no, let me tell you, look, everything else is junk. And you're going to come here and tell me, talk about women's rights? Let's talk about women's rights. Let's talk about what's happening with women in this country, right? You have a Me Too movement, you have a harassment up the wazoo, right? And you're going to tell me that, Islam's, views on gender, so that attitude sometimes is very important because people expect that, I'm going to attack the religion and the religion has to defend itself, right? As if somehow the status quo is like the gold standard, right? So, wallahu alam, right? Sister had a question. So yeah. Sure. Sheikh said, make him take a basic test. Yeah, finding a spouse is another huge topic, but it's not far-fetched to say that if you want a good religious spouse, go ask for a good religious reference. If a man especially, and a sister as well, has no connection to a religious figure of that's known, not saying that doesn't mean they're not religious, but that is a huge testimony that should be there. So if you're in a community that's active and it has a scholar or a group of scholars in a community, and they're like, who's that brother? It's like, well, they're definitely not a part of this community in that case, right? So that's just, of course, one of many things you can do. But we are planning on doing marital and premarital assessments as well. So it's in the pipeline, right? So give us some time. Inshallah, by the time the kids are ready for marriage, right? It'll be ready, right? Yes.
Summary of the presentation is leading us around shift towards more holistically religious communities or families.
Yes.
So the do's were there, 3 or 4 criteria. And is there anything describing more of don'ts or trade-offs to get there?
Like what type of don'ts?
Mostly aligned towards American life or kids in America.
Yeah, great question. So these studies, I don't have that, so I'm not going to make that claim. But of course, there's a lot of things we can speak about that what do you not want to do with your children. And you can almost do the reverse of this, right? So it's one way is you can say do this, which means don't do the opposite. So if we're talking about parenting, right, all the things we've spoken about, so any sort of harsh parenting, right, that is very authoritarian, right, that does not leave that room for back and forth questioning with the kids, explanation to them, right, don't do that because we know that creates a barrier, right, we know that makes kids retreat away from their parents. Having low quality peers who are not religious, who don't have a value system. So when I talk about value system, having good non-Muslims with good values, right, that's fine. Right? Because they agree with us on so many different aspects of life, right? They're not the one, their kids are not drinking, the parents don't smoke, the parents don't do drugs, right? If you know that these people have the right value system, then that's a much safer place to put your kids. So be mindful that you're not putting them with peers that are delinquent or deviant in any sort of way, right? So you just take the inverse is the best way to think about what not to do with your kids, right? Well, I think we are at time, inshallah. So if there's anything afterwards, we can maybe try and wrap up a few more things. But jazakumullah khair. It was an honor and pleasure to be with you all. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us and all of our children to that which is best in this life and the next. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun al mursalin. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.